This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a rule that quietly stopped meaning what it says. A word that was supposed to protect you, a word that was supposed to expire, a word that somewhere along the way learned how to live forever. You were told it was temporary. You were told it was narrow. You were told it would end on its own. It didn't. And once a system learns that temporary can be stretched, delayed, extended, and normalized, it doesn't stop at one place. It spreads silently, logically, efficiently. Most people never notice it happening because nothing explodes, nothing collapses, nothing announces itself. But today, something interrupted that process. Not loudly, not emotionally, just decisively. If you care about how power actually moves, who can pause it, who can extend it, and who absorbs the cost when it never ends, stay with me. Because the danger isn't what just happened. It's what had already been happening for years, and why it was so hard to stop. What actually controls the system now isn't outrage. It isn't elections. It isn't even laws, at least not in the way you were taught to think about them. What controls the system is duration. How long something exists before anyone dares to challenge it. How long it operates before it starts to feel normal. How long people live under it before they reorganize their lives around it. Because time does something subtle to power. It converts exception into expectation. When a rule is new, it has to justify itself. When it lasts long enough, it stops asking permission. And here's the shift most people miss. Control doesn't come from who creates a policy. It comes from who can keep it alive, not through votes, not through debate, but through delay, extensions. Procedural fog. Once a system can say, ending this would cause disruption, it has learned the most important trick in governance. It doesn't need to be right anymore. It just needs to already exist. That's the frame you need to hold. Because the story you think this is about isn't where the real leverage sits. For a long time, this system worked very differently. Before, temporary meant uncomfortable. It meant unstable. It meant everyone understood the clock was ticking. You didn't build your future on it. You didn't redesign institutions around it. You didn't treat it like a permanent feature of life. Now, look at what changed. Temporary became livable, then predictable, then reliable. And that's the most dangerous phase. Because the moment people stop asking when something ends, the system stops planning for an end at all. It starts planning for maintenance. Renewal cycles replace sunsets. Extensions replace conclusions. Reviews replace decisions. Nothing dramatic happens. No announcement. No vote. Just a quiet administrative rhythm that keeps things going one more time. And then one more time after that. Slow change doesn't trigger alarms. It dulls them. And by the time anyone realizes the original boundary has vanished, the system can point backward and say, this is how it's been. That's not stability. That's entrenchment. And once that line disappears in one place, it never stays contained because the logic travels. Then the system produced a jolt, not a collapse, not a scandal, a collision. Hundreds of thousands of people operating legally, visibly, routinely were suddenly pulled into a process they never knew existed. Not because they did something wrong, but because their patterns didn't look right to a machine, money moved too often, accounts touched each other too much, activity didn't match the model. There was no accusation, no warning, no human conversation, just flags, reviews, freezes. Lives slowed down overnight, businesses stalled. Lawyers were hired before anyone could explain the charge because there wasn't one. And here's the mistake people make. They treat this like the story, like the shock is the point. It isn't. This wasn't punishment. It was sorting, a system scanning first and deciding later. A system built on the assumption that it's allowed to look at everything all the time, just in case. And when challenged, It didn't argue necessity. It argued continuity. Stopping now would be disruptive. That's when the real question finally surfaced. Not who was targeted, but who authorized this to never stop? Here's how the system actually works. It doesn't start with suspicion, it starts with access. Once a program is labeled temporary, it's given flexibility. Speed, lower thresholds, fewer questions. That's the trade-off we're told is necessary in an emergency. But emergencies don't expire on their own. They have to be ended. And ending something requires a decision someone can be blamed for. So instead, the system shifts responsibility sideways. Programs are extended automatically. Reviews become procedural. Oversight becomes internal. Data is collected in bulk because narrowing it would require justification. And justification creates records. Records create accountability. The beneficiaries are obvious once you look. Agencies keep authority without asking for it again. Courts avoid forcing hard endings. Institutions expand without ever declaring expansion. And the cost doesn't disappear. It's just redistributed. Individuals absorb it. Small entities absorb it. Anyone without the power to delay absorbs it. By the time the damage is visible, the mechanism can point to its own age and say, you can't pull this out now. That's not governance. That's inertia weaponized. And once you see it here, you start to recognize it everywhere. Then it sped up. What had been slow and administrative became immediate and mechanical. No hearings, no explanations, no pause. Systems began acting on their own outputs. Flags triggered actions, actions generated records, records justified more collection. Each step validated the next. You weren't investigated because you were suspected. You were suspected because you were already visible, and visibility became guilt adjacent. The volume mattered, not dozens, not thousands, millions. Too many to review individually, too many to question manually. So discretion disappeared. When people pushed back, they were told the same thing over and over. This isn't new. This has been in place for years. Ending it now would break things. That sentence did more work than any law. Because once continuity becomes the defense, legality becomes secondary. The system doesn't need to argue it should exist, only that it already does. And that's when a quiet technical process crossed a line it could no longer see. Because nothing in the system knew how to stop itself. And nothing that can't stop can't be trusted to stay limited. Here's where it reaches you. Not as an abstraction, not as policy, as friction. You feel it when a routine action takes longer than it should. When a normal transfer triggers questions no one can answer. When a process that used to be automatic suddenly isn't. You adapt. Of course you do. You keep records longer. You avoid certain patterns. You second-guess decisions that were never supposed to be risky. That's the quiet damage. A system doesn't have to accuse you to change your behavior. It just has to watch long enough, and most people never connect that feeling back to the source. They blame themselves, or technology, or how things work now. If this sounds familiar, don't scroll away, because this isn't about whether you're doing anything wrong. It's about what happens when systems are designed without an off switch. Once you normalize being monitored, delayed, reviewed, once you reorganize your life around invisible rules, you stop noticing the loss. And that's exactly why this moment matters. Because something just forced the system to explain itself. And explanations have consequences. This is where it stops being contained. Because systems built this way don't respect borders. They export logic. Once one institution proves that temporary can be stretched indefinitely, others copy it, not out of conspiracy, out of efficiency. Why solve a problem permanently when you can manage it endlessly? Different domains. Same structure. Data collected here flows there. Decisions paused in one place create pressure somewhere else. Rules softened locally, hardened globally, and the world notices. When exceptions last long enough, they become signals. They tell other systems what's tolerated, What can be normalized? What won't be clawed back once it's in place? That's how spillover works. Not through dramatic coordination, through quiet imitation. By the time people ask whether this is still temporary, the question is already outdated because other systems have already adjusted. They've already assumed continuity. And now the risk isn't just misuse, it's dependency. Because when multiple systems start relying on something that was never meant to last, ending it doesn't just disrupt one process. It destabilizes everything built on top of it. And that's the tension this moment is sitting inside. From here, the system has three ways forward. The first is adjustment. Rules tighten. Boundaries are restored. Temporary actually ends. Systems shrink back to what they were authorized to do. It's slower, messier. It requires real decisions, real accountability, and real acceptance that some convenience was never legitimate in the first place. The second path is erosion. Nothing dramatic breaks. Instead, limits are reinterpreted. Workarounds appear. New language replaces old language. Temporary disappears, but the structure survives under a different name. Oversight exists, technically, but it's always one step behind. This is the most comfortable path. And the most deceptive, the third path is rupture. The system resists being constrained. Programs collide with enforcement. Expectations crash into reality. People who planned their lives around continuity discover it wasn't guaranteed. Institutions built on extension face deadlines they can't delay. None of these paths are clean. None are painless. And here's the critical part. Which path unfolds doesn't depend on courts alone, or agencies, or laws on paper. It depends on whether this moment is treated as a correction or an inconvenience to be engineered around. And that decision hasn't been made yet. Here's what makes this moment dangerous. Not because something ended, but because something had to be stopped. Systems that expect to run forever don't respond well to limits. They adapt, they rebrand, they wait for attention to move on, and attention always moves on. The risk now isn't backlash, it's forgetfulness. Because once the pressure fades, the incentives return. Convenience reasserts itself. Emergency logic quietly finds new language. Temporary becomes necessary. Necessary becomes standard. And the system tries again. That's why this doesn't end here. It can't. Not if the question underneath remains unanswered. Who gets to decide when an exception is over? Who absorbs the cost when it isn't? And how many parts of your life are already organized around rules that were never meant to last? There is no final verdict today, only a pause. What comes next will depend on whether people treat this as a signal or as background noise. If you want to understand where this is heading, how the next workaround forms, where pressure builds next, and what breaks when it does, you'll need to keep watching. Because the most important changes never announce themselves. They just wait for permission to continue.